All right, well, I'll go ahead and start introducing. Barrett Ersek is a professional speaker, consultant, and author on innovation. He's lectured on business innovation at MIT, the London Business School, and the India School of Business, as well as many entrepreneur groups around the world. Barrett's also CEO and founder of Wholeganics, um, LLC, a manufacturer of plant probiotics that naturally boost crop yield and reduce the need for chemical fertilizers and pesticides, which you just said that agriculture is doing great right now. So that's awesome. In addition to founding that, Barrett also built and sold two additional green industry companies. He recently authored the popular Harvard Business Review article, Breaking Your Industry Bottlenecks, which is the topic he's going to be bringing to you all today. It's identifying and overcoming bottlenecks in your business and industry, as well as adding values to your customers' lives by making your product or service better, cheaper, safer, more convenient to potentially make or to potentially reach a 7 to 10 advantage over your competitors. So Barrett, welcome. We're excited to have you today.
Yeah, thank you.
And I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you.
Okay, great. Well, I'm happy to be here. Thank you, Petra, for inviting me. I love the Petra organization and love working with the organization. They've even been a coach in some of my companies. So for those of you who have engaged Petra, you know what I'm talking about. For those of you who are looking at Petra, it's a great organization to help you scale your business. With that, let's get to what we're here today to talk about, which is breaking your industry bottlenecks.
Hey Barrett, let me add one thing real quick and just
Yeah.
remind everyone that's watching that this will be recorded and you'll get a recap afterwards. Always get that question. And the chat and Q&A are at the bottom. Feel free to shoot your questions in. This is an interactive session and Barrett's happy to answer your questions.
Yeah, and by all means, we can wait to the end and ask questions as normally happens. But if you hear me talk about a specific topic and you want to jump in with a question right there to help clarify things, by all means, send them in. If Leah can help, bring those questions to light, we can work them in real time as well. So again, my name is Barrett Ersek, and I'm an entrepreneur. I have a day job, which is running my current company called Wholeganics. I've built and sold two other companies. This is my third startup. The stuff that we're going to talk about today around innovation and breaking your industry bottlenecks, we've broken down a methodology to find your industry bottleneck and to create an X factor, which is the definition of an X factor is creative innovation that leads to a 7 to 10 times competitive advantage. This methodology came from a combination of things that I've learned that was originally introduced to me by Vern Harnish, but also things that I've done to implement these strategies into my company. So this is going to be a lot talking from my experience and talking from how we use these strategies in my companies as I build them and create scale and value with those companies. So before we get started, let's just be really clear with what an innovator is. An innovator sees what could be, not what is. And so it's about asking the right question. And that is so important, to ask the right question. That's the key to this whole process. But specifically, how can I find greater potential from every person, every situation, every process, every experience, every outcome? So again, it's not seeing what is, it's having a passion for possibilities and seeing what could be. Again, I want to give credit where credit's due. This concept called the X factor, 7 to 10 times leveraged creative innovation leads to a 7 to 10 times competitive advantage, was introduced to me through Vern Harnish of Scaling Up, Mastering the Rockefeller Habits. I'm sure everybody knows Vern. He was a teacher of mine back in 2000, 2001, 2002, continues to be a mentor, teacher, and friend of mine. And this X Factor idea was inspired by him. So this idea of execution versus innovation, this is the number one thing that you've got to get before you can even start the process. You've got to understand the difference between execution and innovation. Both are critical to running our businesses. Both are critical scaling up. As entrepreneurial companies, relatively small to mid-sized entrepreneurial companies, we spend a lot of time in the execution part of our business. We have to, or we're going to go out of business. And a lot of this is just getting through the systems and processes that help us produce and deliver and sell our goods and services. A lot of the execution is all the fires that kind of hit us on a daily basis that we have to put out and constantly respond to and solve issues. That's execution. And if we don't execute well, we will go out of business. But at the same time, if we do focus only on execution, then we're only going to typically get incremental improvement, a 5% improvement, a 2% improvement, a 6% improvement, what have you. These are all good things, and they allow us to stay in business and continue to drive the ball forward. But we're not likely going to get that exponential leverage if we stay in execution all the time. And so we have to have the discipline to step out of execution and carve out at least a small amount of time for innovation thinking. And innovation thinking is where we're going to get our exponential leverage. Now, let me give you another way to think about this. Execution, if you think about business bottlenecks, these are bottlenecks that are part of your company, but they may not be part of your top 3 competitors, may not have the same bottleneck. Okay, so if it's a challenge that you have, but your top 3 competitors don't have, and you're working on it, then chances are you're only going to get incremental improvement, and that's where execution lies. But if it's a bottleneck that you have, and so do your top 3 competitors, then it's likely an industry bottleneck. And those are the bottlenecks we want to work on to find massive leverage and get that exponential leverage. So when you think about a bottleneck, like I'll give you an example. If I had the right CFO, then I could really grow my business. Well, finding the right CFO is an execution-oriented bottleneck for my business. It's not my top 3 competitors. They're not looking for a good CFO. If I had the right warehousing, then I could really grow my business. Again, that is an industry. That's not an industry bottleneck. That's a business bottleneck. It's a problem I have. My top 3 competitors don't have. But I ship fertilizer-like product across the country, and it's very heavy and it's a lot of volume. So it's expensive to ship fertilizer across the country. Well, that's a problem I have, and so does all the large fertilizer producers have the same problem. So that's an industry bottleneck. So I just want to give you that very quick example of where we're spending our time. And in our strategy planning and in our weeklies, our dailies, our monthlies, our quarterlies, our annual planning sessions, we want to have 90% of that planning should be on execution. But I'd like to challenge you and say, carve out 10% of the agenda and spend it on innovation thinking. And we're going to go through some systems and processes on how you can do that in your company. When we think about breaking our industry bottlenecks, the first thing we have to do is identify our industry bottlenecks. And again, we've already sorted the difference between an industry bottleneck and a business bottleneck. Now we want to take our team and we want to sit down and say, okay, what are 5 industry bottlenecks that our industry has, and so do our top 3 competitors, our entire industry, in each one of these categories? And we like to break it down to these 5 diagnostic levers because it forces us to look at the business and the revenue streams and the value creation from the different stakeholders, from the lenses of the different stakeholders within the companies that we serve. Not just the customers, not just the employees, but could be the investors, could be a secondary community that could be impacted. So let's take a look at these 5 diagnostic levers. We want to look at eliminating superfluous expense. So this is pretty simple. It seems pretty simple, and it may seem so simple that you're inclined not to even go here. But I would challenge you, write down your 5 industry bottlenecks that you would have, and so would your top 3 competitors, from your P&L perspective. So it could be, the top 5 expenses, or it could be those expenses and how they relate to revenue. So you could say, well, labor is one of my top 5 expenses. Okay, so I put labor there. Or I could say revenue per employee. So it's not just labor. I don't want to just get rid of 90% of my labor. What I want to do is get 9 times more productivity out of each one of my people. Then I can create a lot more opportunity for the people that work for me. So if my revenue per employee is $250,000 per employee, how could I go to 2.5 million per employee? That would be a way to kind of think about leveraging our top 5 expenses by a factor of 7 to 10 times. And we're going to go through some examples of companies that have done this. So don't worry if you're not following this exactly at this moment. This is just an introduction to the diagnostic levers. Then we're going to dive into some very clear examples. Then we're going to review the process step by step. And then we're going to send you, if you want to dive in deeper, we have a Harvard Business Review article that takes you through this as well. And I can be available to answer questions through email afterwards, even if we don't get to them today. So you got your top 5 diagnostic levers. You've got your eliminating your superfluous expense. The next one is the customer buying or using experience. So what is getting in the way of your customers getting the product, your product or service, when they want, how they want, in a manner that's easy for them to consume and use? So what's getting in the way of your customers interfacing with your product or service at the time, the quantity, or the speed that they want to, or the ease that they want to? And write down 5 industry bottlenecks from that. And then we want to look at the customer's psychological barriers. Often in companies, people want to buy your product or service, they want to use your product or service, but they're afraid, they're ashamed, they're embarrassed, they're unsure, they're confused. These are all psychological bottlenecks. So what are 5 psychological bottlenecks in your industry that prevent people from buying your or using your product or service as quickly as you'd like them to, or as easily as you'd like them to? And then we always look at hearts and minds. So what are the hearts and minds that if you could win those hearts and minds of a key constituency group would really propel your company to growth. So in some cases, like let's say fast food restaurants, you might look at a group like Chick-fil-A or In-N-Out Burger, where they would say that the frontline employee, they have to win the hearts and minds of that frontline employee. And if they can do that, then they can get a really high level of service and get high revenue per square foot, high gross margin per square foot. You know, when you look at a Chick-fil-A compared to a McDonald's, Chick-fil-A is killing it compared to McDonald's on a profit per square foot, and they're only open 6 days a week. How do they do it? Well, they got good food but at the end of the day, they've won the hearts and minds of their frontline people in a way that McDonald's has not figured out how to do. And so it could be the frontline people. If you're in the IT business, it could be getting those talented programmers. Or if you're in other businesses, it could be a referral source. So it could be, let's just say we're in the insurance business, it could be winning the hearts and minds of entrepreneurial-oriented accountants. And I'm just using an example. But it doesn't have to be inside your company as an employee group. It could be outside your company like a referral source, or it could be a group that could put you out of business if they start talking about you in the wrong way. I mean, let's look at, we've seen lots of companies with bad press, and, you get a Ralph Nader type on your back. That could be a key constituency you don't want to get attention from. And then look at your eliminating negative externalities. So some businesses like mine, I was in the chemical fertilizer business. It was pretty simple for me to look at my industry and say, what are the negative externalities with chemical fertilizers? Well, the more people use them, the more runoff we have into our waterways. It creates problems in our waterways. So, I hit that, and that led me to the company that we're in today by looking at that X factor, that industry bottleneck question that led me to the X factor of my current company, which is how can we create healthy crops and healthy soils using 7 to 10 times less chemical fertilizers? And we found that we could get there through a microbial solution instead of a chemical solution. And that's what we're out there implementing today. So in a chemical business, it's obviously easy. And in other companies, it might not be as easy to see that negative externality. But I mean, we've seen Apple with Foxconn, right? Apple's trying to get the cheapest iPhones they can. They have this big company in China called Foxconn that makes them. And all of a sudden, they're driving such productivity in Foxconn that people are jumping out of the building and killing themselves because it's such a tough place to work. So that was a negative externality associated with Apple just trying to drive the cost of their phone down. I don't think they intended to create that work environment. But if we don't stop and think about what are the negative externalities associated with the growth of our company or the growth of our industry, then those things could surprise us, and could be a place of leverage to help you grow your business, or it could be a place of leverage to put you out of business if you don't take the time to sit and at least consider it. So let's take a look at some of the examples of companies who have found these industry bottlenecks and found their X factor and dominated an industry for at least a period of time. And where did that fit into our diagnostic levers? So let's look at the first one, the P&L expense. So you think about the video rental market, DVDs and VCRs. Today we do everything on demand and streaming. But back in the 90s, we used to rent all of our DVDs and VCR tapes from Blockbuster Video. That was the #1 video chain in America. They had their own X factor, which was that they had 7 to 10 times more copies of videos on their shelf than their competitors did. So you knew if you went into a Blockbuster, you'd get the copy you wanted when you wanted it. B, they had 7 to 10 times more stores than anybody else. So nobody could compete with Blockbuster in the 90s and into the early 2000s. But if you think about it, look at your P&L from Blockbuster. Pretend you're the Blockbuster executive, Blockbuster Video, and you say, hey, I've got all these stores, with all these videos. What are my top 5 expenses? Well, if you think about it, it would be real estate and labor. Okay, so what if I could reduce my top 5 expenses by a factor of 7 to 10 times? Would it change my industry? Well, Redbox came in and asked that question and innovated that industry for at least a period of time. And I love this example because it's so simple. What did Redbox do? They put DVDs into basically a Coca-Cola vending machine and allowed you to rent movies for $1 a night, where Blockbuster was charging $4 and $5 a night at the time. And Redbox was able to put these video vending machines in the grocery stores, in the strip centers where there was already a Blockbuster. So not only are they more convenient than Blockbuster, because you have to walk past a Redbox machine while you're at the grocery store before you walk down to the Blockbuster, they're cheaper than Blockbuster. They've got no labor and no real estate costs compared to what Blockbuster has. So they really took that industry around that was heavily labor, heavily retail investment on a rent and per square foot type of thing, and they massively reduced labor and real estate, and they put these things into a vending machine, a very simplistic model. It's interesting to know that in 2000, Blockbuster dominated, and by 2008, 62% of all video rentals, DVD rentals, were going through a Redbox machine. And in 2010, Blockbuster went bankrupt. And today we don't even know there is a Blockbuster. Unless you go on Netflix, there is actually a movie on right now called The Last Blockbuster, and it's a documentary about the last Blockbuster that still exists and the culture around it. But nonetheless, Redbox came in with their Coca-Cola machine in a DVD machine and a Coca-Cola vending machine, and they changed the model. They disrupted the industry, and they grew like crazy. Now, of course, every X factor, every innovation is today's innovation is tomorrow's commodity. So Redbox didn't stay on top forever. Eventually, video on demand and Netflix and Amazon Prime and all those other things that we use to consume our video today hasn't put Redbox out of business. You'll still see Redboxes in the Walmarts and whatnot, but it's made it a much less relevant business model. But for a time, 2008, they had 62% of the DVD rental market, and in 2000, they didn't exist. So just think about that. I like that example because it shows us the idea of synthesized innovation. So did Redbox create some new technology that never existed before? No. Redbox took an innovation that happened in 1923 with the Coca-Cola vending machine, and they modified it to fit their industry. Hey, how do we rent DVDs out of a Coke machine? Obviously, they had to change the interface and they use the way it uses it, but it was the same general concept. So we call that synthesized innovation. If you look at your industry bottleneck, look at another industry that solved a similar bottleneck and see, could we modify that innovation and tie it to our industry and solve our industry bottleneck? It's a great way to look for a solution. Another example of the synthesized innovation is this Little Caesars hot and ready zone. And so Little Caesars really promoted this big time during COVID. And if you look at that little kiosk on the end of that counter there, what they would do is they would take their top 3 pizzas that, everybody wants one of 3 different kinds of pizza, whether it's cheese, pepperoni, whatever. And they would have them hot and fresh in that little vending machine ready for you. You go in, you touch your credit card to the pad, you pull out the pizza you want, you're gone. You don't have to order the pizza. You don't have to call ahead. You don't have to wait for it to be done. You don't have to talk to a person, see a person, come in contact with a person. All of a sudden, Little Caesars is able to get you hot and fresh pizza 7 to 10 times quicker than their competition without coming in contact with another human being. And so that was a great way, again, to use that synthesized innovation. It's a modification of a vending machine, right? That they use to help create hot, fresh, quick pizza. So that's innovations from that first diagnostic lever, that P&L, the superfluous expense. Now let's take a look at the psychological bottlenecks that might be involved with people interfacing our products or services. So this is a fun example. If you happen to be a wine connoisseur, or as others might call you, a wine snob, depending on your point of view, you'll look at this bottle of Louis Latour, which is the one that, if you're looking at the screen, would be to the left. And if you look at that bottle, it's a beautiful bottle of wine, and you can read all these different words that describe the region, the year, and as a result, you'll understand the tannins and the way it's going to smell and taste and the complications of the palate and blah, blah, blah. I'm not a wine guy, so, excuse me if I don't use the right terms there. But there's a lot of words that they put onto that label to help the wine connoisseur understand that that's a really good bottle of wine. The problem is there's a whole bunch of people that want to buy wine, but they're embarrassed, confused, ashamed. They don't know how to look at those words and understand them. They don't spend their weekend studying the Wine Spectator to understand what region, tannins, blah, 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 that they need to be paying attention to. What was a good year? What was a bad year? So they want to buy a bottle of wine. They want to share it with friends, but they're confused when they go into a wine store to buy a bottle of wine. Well, Casilla, which is the parent company to Yellowtail, they figured this out because in the early 2000s, Casilla was the fastest growing wine brand in the United States. They had massive growth rates from like 2002 to 2008. Now, when Casilla came into the United States as a brand new wine, there was an average of 162 bottles choices. You had 162 different choices of wine you could buy in your average wine retailer. And so obviously we needed 163 because Casilla comes in and they're the fastest growing wine brand that the wine industry had seen in a very long time. Well, we didn't need 163. We just needed somebody who's going to communicate to us in a different way so we could appeal to that consumer that wanted to buy wine, but they were afraid, embarrassed, confused to buy wine. So instead they went and bought vodka or beer. And if you look at we always like to look at our industry bottlenecks and try to think about them in a metrically driven kind of challenge. So what was the psychological bottleneck from a metrically driven perspective if we look at these two bottles of wine? Well, if we look at the Louis Latour, there's 27 words on that label to tell you why you should buy that bottle of wine. And Louis Latour's biggest competitor is going to have something like 27 words. And of that 168 varieties of wine, or 162 varieties of wine that you could have chosen, most of them had a Louis Latour strategy. There were another group that was the jug wine, the box wine, like get drunk cheap wine, and they had a different strategy. But people didn't want to get that either because they didn't want to come in and be the guy who brought the jug wine to the party, right? Well, Yellowtail figured this out and they said, hey, we're going to have a bottle of wine that's going to be very approachable, easy to buy, easy to drink, fun to share. And not are we going to, we're not going to use 27 words to describe our wine. We're going to use 3. So remember, 7 to 10 times multiplier or 7 to 10 times divider. So they made it 7 to 10 times easier to look at this bottle of Yellowtail and decide you wanted to buy it. Not only do they not tell you what region it's from, you're not even sure what country it's from. If you look at this bottle of wine, you see a kangaroo, so you think, well, I guess it's probably from Australia, but you don't really know. It doesn't say Australia. Could be from any place. And it just says Yellowtail Chardonnay. There's a few other words at the bottom, but that's all just legal mumbo jumbo. That's all they used to communicate their wine. It was easy to drink, easy to buy, fun to share. Yellowtail became the fastest growing wine because they solved the psychological bottleneck for a massive constituency that wanted to buy wine, but they were confused and didn't know how to buy wine. So what are you doing with your products or services that are making them hard to buy from a psychological perspective, makes it complicated, confusing, or people are scared or they don't trust or they're embarrassed or ashamed to buy your product or service? And if you can find a way to solve that, you could get some massive leverage. Now let's take a look at a few EO companies. I like to look at a few big companies that people have heard of, and I like to look at a few EO companies that we can all relate to. So Apple Tree Answers. Many of you may have heard of John Ratliff and the Apple Tree story. He's been kind of talked about through Vern and the Petra group as a great case study. I love looking at John's X factor and how he figured it out. John's business was a really simple, low-tech business of basically answering the phone. He had a phone service. So doctors, lawyers, plumbers that needed to have the phone answered, 24 hours a day, but didn't have people manning the office 24 hours a day. They hired John's service to answer the phone for them. So they answered the phone when you couldn't be in the office. That was the business. Nothing sophisticated, nothing sexy, pretty nuts and bolts, simple business. It was not a fun business to run from John's point of view before he figured out his X factor. John's turnover rate would vary from 100% to 150% per year of his frontline employees. On average, it was 110%. So in other words, every year he has to replace that frontline position of that frontline employee. And John's numbers were better than the industry. The industries were more like 200%, right? So he thought he was really on top of things, but he still had to replace that person, that frontline call center, more than once a year. So think about that. He had to go recruit, train, right, and then get that person up to speed in their position, and then within less than a year they're going to leave, and you're going to have to recruit, train, and get somebody else up to speed. Could you ever really get a high quality employee up to speed quickly enough, or were they always in training? Did people really love and care about that job? Probably not. So as a result, the people that hired John's service to get their phones answered when they weren't in their office, they didn't get a great level of service, not just from John's company, but from really any answering service. It was very common to get poor service. And so the only way they really could differentiate is on their hourly rate of what they charged, which then squeezed the gross margins of the business and the industry down to something that was not very much fun to be in. John recognized this and he said, hey, what if I could get my industry turnover from 110% down to just 15%? What if I could do that? Would that change my industry? Ooh, maybe it would. Because think about it. He spends about $5,000 to recruit, hire, and train a new person. So if that person lasts for 5 years instead of 10 months, that $5,000 is spread over a much longer period of time. So it's much more efficient. You'd have to spend 50, 60, 70,000 to replace people every year over 5 years, where here he could keep those people for 5 years and make a lot more money. But more importantly, he could invest in those people and he could train them and make them better and better and better and help them learn how to really care about what they do as a profession. And so John did a bunch of initiatives to help make their lives better. But the one that's kind of the most fun that I think really really made things go a lot faster for him as far as retention goes, is this initiative he called Dream On. And if you, I don't have time to give you the entire initiative right now, but if you just go to YouTube and type in Apple Tree Dream On, you'll see a 12-minute video that his employees did. It'll bring a tear to your eye. But basically what John did is he realized that a lot of his frontline people, they're basically minimum wage or just above. They've got a lot of challenging lives, and they don't have a lot of resources to deal with a lot of those challenges. Things like burying their parents, things like the first one that he really recognized was a woman that was out living in her car. She was in a domestic violent situation and had to leave her apartment where her spouse or boyfriend was, violent. Her and her child were living in a car, and she was answering phones at nighttime. And John saw this and said, we could help these people. And so he thought about the Make-A-Wish Foundation, and he decided to kind of create a dream bucket and put it in the office. And if you've got a dream, something we could help you with, put it in the dream box. And if we can help solve it, we will. We're not going to buy a Mercedes type of thing, but we've got a lot of resources and connections. And as a company, if we can help make your lives better, we want to do that. They have no obligation to share that or to promote that they were helped, but they just wanted to do it to be good. And what he found out is as soon as he started granting some of these wishes, like helping that woman get an apartment and get it furnished, helping another employee bury their parents, he realized that these people were they talk about it to the rest of their employees, and it made it a really family fun place to work, that people at that level could really feel appreciated, and they could feel like they had a place to be. And so as a result, John's turnover rate went down from 110% to below 30%. And as a result, because he had improved retention, he had higher quality. He could charge more money per hour than his competitors. He also had higher retention, so he didn't have to spend that money to recruit and train. His gross margins went from 47% to 60%. And over a 5-year period, John's group had granted 275 dreams and spent about $400,000 doing so. So the exponential leverage they got out of that was far more than the $400,000. John took his original call center concept and he bought a whole bunch of call centers across the country at very low multiples because nobody wanted to buy call center businesses. He converted them to his culture around the Dream On, around employee retention, improved margins, improved quality, and eventually got to a 500-seat call center that he sold to a publicly traded company for a significant multiple. And so the point is, John was able to win the hearts and minds of his frontline employee, and as a result, drove his margins higher and drove the quality of his business higher, and really revolutionized his industry to a degree. And so, what is a key constituency that you can win the hearts and minds of? That if you got them really on your team in an enthusiastic way, they could propel your business to grow much faster, much better, much more efficiently. Let's take a look at another entrepreneur's EO organization. That's one of my favorite guys that in EO. His name is Brian Scudamore, and he ran a business called, and still runs a business called O2E, Ordinary to Excellent. So Ordinary to Excellent is the name of his parent company, but the brand, and there's several brands that operate underneath of that O2E. The brand you would recognize would be 1-800-GOT-JUNK. So Brian started 1-800-GOT-JUNK. Really, again, an unsophisticated industry, trash removal. His idea was to bring professional kind of service and customer service to a blue collar fragmented industry that isn't known for high levels of customer service. That was his general concept. The way he goes to market is through a franchise organization. So Brian's real bottleneck was in his industry, and everybody else that was doing blue collar franchises was finding high quality franchisees. Not just finding, so then you look at, okay, why is it hard to find these high quality franchisees? Well, because somebody's going to make a big investment into becoming part of your franchise network. They're taking a risk, first of all, and their idea is to create a business and become profitable as soon as they can. So Brian recognized that if he wanted to attract the best franchisees to his network that were looking at blue collar franchise opportunities, Brian realized that the bottleneck was, how can we get our franchisees from $0 to $1 million in profitable as fast as possible? How can we do it 7 to 10 times quicker than the average industry blue collar franchise would get there from? And the average blue collar franchise opportunity goes from 0 to $1 million in profitable in about 6 years. So it takes the average franchise organization 6 years to get there in this type of space. Brian said, okay, what if we can do it in under a year? So their entire team became obsessed about that question. That was their essential question, their metrically driven question. The first was they found their industry bottleneck, which was it takes too long to become $1 million of revenue and profitable. It takes too long to get there. So what if we could, so then he turned that into his metrically driven question. How can we go from 6 years to under a year? By becoming obsessed about that question, they came up with a bunch of different ways to help their franchisees become successful quickly and profitable quickly. And they indeed did get it down to just over a year. They didn't get just under a year. They got it to just over a year, I think 14 months last I talked to Brian. And some of the things that they've done, you've seen, they got really good at guerrilla marketing. And I bet you, if any of you are in North America, you've seen a 1-800-GOT-JUNK parked in a abandoned gas station. You've seen those 1-800-GOT-JUNK lawn signs all over the highway and in vacant lots and what have you. They're really good at doing low-cost guerrilla marketing. They're really good at getting free PR. They're really good at spreading the word without spending a bunch of marketing dollars. And that helps their franchisees become profitable quickly without spending a bunch of dollars on marketing. They did a bunch of other initiatives as well. But the real trick was to identify the industry bottleneck and turn it into that metrically driven question. Remember John Ratliff's metrically driven question. How can I go from 110% turnover down to less than 20%? Brian Scudamore's was, how can I go from 7 years to $1 million in profitable? 6 years to $1 million in profitable down to under a year. So it's about finding the industry bottleneck and then transferring that into a metrically driven question we call the essential question. So this is an example of the hearts and minds. Casilla was an example of psychology bottleneck. Redbox was an example of the P&L. And I'm sorry, Casilla was psychology and Appletree was hearts and minds. So now let's look at, what are we doing to make it easier for our customers to buy our product and service from that category? And it's another EO company that's you may not have heard of today, but you will hear of, I would say, in the next 3 to 6 months based on what they're doing right now. There's some really neat things happening with this organization. The organization is called Change Electric, and they make basically last mile delivery vans for, Pepsi, Amazon, FedEx. If you have a delivery route that's 100 miles or less, you want to do it with an electric truck, they're your group, okay? And there's other people in this space as well. Brian was competing for 10 years with prototype machines and low production and unprofitable, just trying to break into the market. And you might think, well, what's Brian's X factor? It's, reducing greenhouse gases and pollution because he has electric trucks. No, that's not how he sees it, because he's in the electric truck business with a bunch of other electric trucks. They're solving that same problem. He had to stand apart in a whole different way. And so what Brian realized was, as he goes into these fleet managers to go sell them an electric truck, they're used to buying, let's just say, an Isuzu diesel equivalent of that truck that might cost $80,000 to buy the truck. And then they might spend, $1,600 a month, putting diesel in that truck. Well, the fleet managers, they're allowed to spend this much money on a truck and this much money on fuel. And when you start to sell them a product, so Brian's product was, let's say, and I'm making up these numbers, but tells you the story is the same. So I may not be right on the numbers. But let's say Brian's truck was $125,000. It was more than the Isuzu by quite a bit. But you didn't have to pay any fuel bills. So, hey, it's really going to make you more money long term. Well, but that worked for the CEO of the company. That might work for the CFO of the company. But to really get into these big organizations with a large purchase order, they had those guys, the fleet managers, couldn't buy a $125,000 truck with no fuel bill. That they just weren't allowed to think that way. They didn't think that way. Brian realized this. So what Brian did is he went back to these guys because he needed to get big orders, not just, hey, I'll order half a dozen of these trucks and we'll try them out and eventually we'll work it into our fleet. No, I need 2,500 orders now because we got to build a factory. What Brian figured out was, if he could go to the fleet managers and tell them, hey, listen, I got a truck for you. It's going to be $80,000, same as your Isuzu, maybe even a little less than the Isuzu. And we're going to lease you the battery. So you buy the truck and we lease you the battery. We're going to lease you the battery far less than it would have cost you to put diesel in the Isuzu truck. So you're going to save money on a monthly basis and you're going to save money on your capital expenditure up front. It's going to fit right into your spreadsheet like you're used to using because you're used to paying a monthly fee for fuel and a capitalized fee for the truck. We're going to fit into that buying model and we're going to own the battery. We're also going to take that fear away from the fleet manager that says batteries are going to, need to be replaced, and we don't know what they're going to cost and how long they're going to last, and yada yada, all the fears around battery technology. Brian knows Moore's law is affecting batteries just like it's affected computer memory. They're becoming twice as efficient at half the cost every 18 months. So the battery that Brian ultimately will have to replace, because if the battery goes bad, he'll replace it for the customer. It's his battery. It'll be half the cost and twice as good as the battery he sold them originally. So they're going to continue to pay that monthly fee. He'll continue to get a better and better and cheaper battery. Brian has a recurring revenue stream, and Brian gets an order of 2,500 trucks from FedEx as an example when this happens. And so you will see this is all happening right now. And since I've mentioned this, in the next few months, you will start to see this company will be hitting the news wires because they're getting ready to do some big things. So pay attention. But what they really did was they figured out how to solve the using and buying, how to make it easier for their customers to use and buy their trucks the way they wanted to buy their trucks, which is pay for the capital and then monthly charge for the fuel, even though it didn't fit their business model. So pretty cool. So that leads us to Happy Lawn. This was my last company. Not one many of you probably heard of, but what we did is we competed with like Chem Lawn and Lawn Doctor and Weed Man. We went out and put down fertilizer and killed weeds for people. They'd pay us a monthly fee to basically make their grass green and weed free. We never cut grass or planted trees or did landscaping. We just put down fertilizer and killed weeds. So we had a monthly service. People would pay us on average $400 a year to do their lawn. That was anywhere from 5 to 6 times a year. Our average gross profit was 50%, pretty good gross profit. But if you looked at our real problem, our industry bottleneck, was our acquisition cost to acquire a new client. So our acquisition cost in the lawn care industry was all the money we spent on digital advertising, direct mail, telemarketing, whatever we had to do to get the phone to ring and get people to want to buy our service. Then we had to have salesmen to basically take the phone call, and we had to have estimators go out and measure the lawn because we didn't know what the square footage of the lawn is. And again, this example I'm going to give you is back from 2000, but it was the first time I used this X factor concept to really revolutionize my business and my industry, and catapult my business and growth. And so I looked at this and I said, this is just messed up. Our acquisition cost of $275, 50% gross margin. It takes us 6 quarters to cover our acquisition costs. So from a cash flow perspective, it wasn't a very efficient business. It wasn't a very efficient industry. And so what I did is Vern Harnish identified the concept around the X factor to me. And he says, what's that one thing in your business that's just messed up? If you could fix it, you could grow to infinity and beyond, like Buzz Lightyear. And for me, it became that acquisition cost. So I took that idea around my acquisition cost is $275. And I put it into my first essential question, which was, how can I get my acquisition cost from $275 down to $27? So divide by 10, right? 7 to 10 times multiplier, 7 to 10 times divider. When we think about this X factor, turn your industry bottleneck, my acquisition cost is too high, turn that into a metrically driven question that's got a 7 to 10 times multiplier or divider on it. So in this case, how do I go from 275 to 27? We divided by 10. So that's my essential question. Then I got obsessed about that essential question. I asked everybody that ever talked to me about, tell them about my business model, tell them why it was expensive, and tell them, hey, do you got any ideas on how I can solve this? And so I talked about it to everybody. And eventually I came up with some ideas. I didn't actually come up with the ideas. Other people gave me the ideas. I assimilated all those ideas and put them into a new business model that would allow us, in fact, to significantly drop our acquisition cost. And not only did we come up with the idea, but we implemented the idea and we put it to work. And it was the instant happy quote. Now, this looks pretty simple today, but you got to remember, we did this back in like 2002, 2001. So Google Earth did not exist. We used to lease aerial maps, which is what you're looking at here. That's what Google Earth bought this company called Globe Explorer. We used to lease maps from Globe Explorer for $50,000 a year just for the Baltimore metro area. And so we created a web-based program that could take aerial photography, GIS imaging, and tax map data, and basically measure your lawn, your square footage of your lawn, take out your driveway, your house, your swimming pool, and we could figure out how much grass you had, and then we could give you a price right over the phone. My competitors were sending people out to measure the lawn, length times width, and then come back and call you on your phone and while you're eating dinner and try to sell you lawn care. Meantime, we're giving the people an estimate right over the phone. Our inbound close rate, when people called us up for an estimate and we could give them a price right over the phone and schedule the service, our inbound close rate went from 80% or 20% close rate to 80% close rate. Our time to service the lawns went from 3 weeks from the day you called to the day we did an estimate and finally sold you and then did the lawn. It would take about 3 weeks down to 3 days. We would service your lawn in 3 days. The application was free. And our cost per sale went from 275. We didn't get to 27, which was my goal, but we got to 50. And when we got to 50, we were able to spend the same dollars of marketing, but get almost 6 times more customers from those same dollars because it was so much cheaper. It came back to us so much quicker. We were cash flow positive after the second application. And so as a result, it became a much more profitable business. My first business was called Custom Care Lawn Service. That was the one where I identified the bottleneck. I sold that company to Scott's to create Happy Lawn and the Happy Quote system. And the second business, my first business took me 7 years to get to $2 million. This business, it took me like 7 weeks to break $1 million, and 7 months we had over 2 million. And then we went 5 million before the next year. And then went 8 million before the next year. We went 10 million before the next year. We could have grown much faster, but we couldn't service the lawns quickly enough. It became an execution bottleneck. We couldn't hire and train, our technicians quickly enough. So we just shut the marketing spigot off all the time because we just couldn't service well enough. But we solved the marketing problem. We solved the customer acquisition problem. And by the way, today, if you get a lawn care estimate, there's one of 3 platforms that are basically measuring everybody's lawns today. We're one of those 3 platforms. We still have a royalty deal on that, and other people, run it, but it's still our technology. And so we really did revolutionize the lawn care industry through that model. And so I use this same methodology to run my companies. And sometimes I find X factors, and sometimes I find, singles and doubles. If you're thinking about a baseball analogy, you don't always get a home run, right? Sometimes you get a single, sometimes you get a double, sometimes you get that home run, like that instant happy quote. So we were in that business. We grew it we were the largest independent lawn care company in the Mid-Atlantic. We had over 100 trucks that went out every day and sprayed lawns. And in that process, I asked myself the question. I went back to my X factor process, and I asked myself my next industry bottleneck, metrically driven question, which was, how come, I noticed that the more successful our industry got, the more fertilizer, the more chemicals, the more our waterways were polluted. And so I started to say, what if we could create green, weed-free lawns, healthy soils, we're using 7 to 10 times less nitrates, phosphates, pesticides. And so that led us to a quest to try to find a way to do that. And over a lot of trial and error and over a long period of time, we found a microbial consortium using basically bacteria, fungi, protozoa, and amoeba to basically produce healthier functional soils, which would then in turn feed the plants naturally. Not totally naturally, you still need to use fertilizers and chemicals, but much less of them. Everything works much better, much more efficiently when we get that microbial population in check. And so that led me to sell that company to ChemLawn, the lawn spray company that had the happy quote, and start a new company called Organics. And Organics' mission is to help revolutionize the way we grow plants, turf, as well as agricultural plants and landscape plants in a more efficient way by using less fertilizers, less chemicals, which is part of our BHAG. This is our why in our company, which is to eliminate 100 million pounds of nitrates, 25 million pounds of phosphates, and 100 million ounces of concentrated pesticides from entering the universe by Earth Day 2023. And to date, we're about halfway there. So every gallon of material we sell, there's a rough calculation as to how many pounds of nitrates, phosphates, and pesticides did not get used because people chose to use a microbial organic solution versus a traditional chemical solution. So this is how we measure how we're doing well while we're doing good. It also is loosely tied to revenue, but it also tells my employees why they come to work each day. And it all came from that X factor question, that metrically driven question, that essential question: how can we create green, weed-free lawns using 7 to 10 times less nitrates, phosphates, and pesticides? So with that, we just looked at a bunch of different examples, and we continue to use this process in my company today. We don't always come up with our 7 to 10x multiplier, but we always come up with things that are 20% better, 30% better, 50% better. And sometimes we come up with those 7 to 10xers just by going through the process. So here's a review of the process right here. Make sure I'm on time, which I am. First, identify your industry versus your business bottleneck. Again, an industry bottleneck is a problem you have, and so do your top 3 competitors. If your top 3 competitors don't have that bottleneck, it's probably a business bottleneck. Doesn't mean you shouldn't work on it, but it's not where you're going to get your exponential leverage. Then we look at those 5 diagnostic levers, and we try to brainstorm a bunch of bottlenecks. Doesn't mean you're going to work on them all, but you just want to come up with a big list, and then you can find the one that you really want to work on. So come up with 5 bottlenecks from each one of those points of view, from those diagnostic levers. Then circle the one that seems most compelling to you from each category. So you got your top 1 of 5 from each of your 5 categories. Now you've got your list of 25, and you've got your top 5. Then once you got your top 5, pick out the one bottleneck, industry bottleneck, that you and your team agree you're going to go work on first. By the way, you can go work on the other ones in 90 or 120 days after you work. It doesn't mean you're going to work on one industry bottleneck for the rest of your life, right? But you're going to work on this one first. And the whole team gets focused on one industry bottleneck. Don't have the sales people work on a sales bottleneck and the production people work on a production bottleneck. You'll get too much diffusion there, and you won't get the power and the focus. So once you come up with your number 1 bottleneck, then I like to ask, as a team, you ask it out loud to each other, why is this a bottleneck? Why is this a problem? Why is this a problem? Why is this a problem? And the reason that you want to ask 5 times why this specific thing is a problem is because you'll go from something that's kind of amorphous to something that's much more granular by asking that why 5 times. So I could have said, well, my cost of sales is just too high. Well, why is it too high? Right? And then I could break down the process. Oh, well, one of the reasons it's too high is because we've got these guys who go out and measure these lawns. One of the reasons it's too high is because it takes us several weeks from the day you call us to do an estimate to where we call you back to get the lawn scheduled, and then you don't care about your lawn anymore. So I could go through all those things, and I would get to something that's much more granular that I could put a metrically driven question to. So after you ask yourself why 5 times, you get it really granular. You then turn it into the essential question. So if you think about, John Ratliff, how can I go from 110% turnover down to less than 20? If you look at my Happy Lawn example, how can I go from a $275 cost per sale down to 27? So turn it into that metrically driven question. If you can't measure it, you can't improve it. So it can't just be, how do I go from a lousy cost per sale to a better cost per sale? Or how do I dramatically improve my frontline employee engagement? No, it's got to be metrically driven. Okay. Then you got to program your reticular activating system and get your team to program their reticular activating system. This is part of your subconscious brain that controls what you pay attention to because you're emotionally connected to it. And the way you program your reticular activating system is you write your essential question down on a 3x5 card. You read it to yourself 5 times a day. Before breakfast, before lunch, before dinner, before you go to bed, and one more time just for fun. So you got 5 times every single day, you and your executive team are reading the same question. The reason you do that is because it's a little mini active meditation. It keeps that question top of mind. It makes it part of your reticular activating system, part of your subconscious. All of a sudden, you'll be dreaming about solutions to your X factor. You'll get a coffee at the Starbucks, and you'll see the way the baristas talk to each other, and it'll click an idea in your head that's totally unrelated on how you're going to solve your industry bottleneck. So get obsessed. Get your people obsessed. If you don't do that, this is all going to be an intellectual exercise, and you won't get that big breakthrough. Create an innovation rhythm with your company. So again, take 10% of your planning, your weeklies, your monthlies, your quarterlies, your annualies. Just take a small block of that and carve out, 15 minutes, 30 minutes, 2 hours, as we go into the longer planning cycles, to spend with your team to say, we're not going to talk about our execution challenges. We're only going to talk about our innovation opportunities. And if you create that innovation rhythm with a focus and a structure around it, you will create innovation within your company. And then you want to take action. So when you come up with ideas, don't just think about them and write them down, but actually take action on them. Measure your results, create KPIs, key performance indicators around the actions you're taking around your essential question, and go try these things out. And when you see something working, do a whole bunch more of that. And when you see something not working, stop doing that, right? But if you don't measure, then you won't know if those things are working or not working. So definitely measure. And then once you find your big X factor, or maybe your 20% improvement, and by the way, that's a really key understanding, just because you're looking for a 7 to 10 times multiplier, if you end up with a 20% multiplier, did you fail? No, 20% multiplier is awesome, right? We're looking for 7 to 10, but if we end up with anything above 0, we're in good shape, right? So don't get frustrated if not every time do you knock it out of the ballpark. Sometimes you get singles, sometimes you get doubles, sometimes you get triples, and sometimes you get home runs. But the key is just keep trying, keep swinging that bat. And so once you find that big innovation and you see it working, put your feet up. It's not time to put your feet up. It's not time to have a long party. Maybe have a short party, you know, for the evening and get some pizza. Next day, go back to work, start over, because today's innovation is tomorrow's commodity. And the only way to stay ahead of your competition is not to break your industry bottleneck and just rest on your laurels, but it's to create a culture of innovation that's always striving to break the next industry bottleneck, always trying to make our products and services better, cheaper, safer, more convenient, somehow adding to the lives of our customers in a way that our competition doesn't do. And if you continually do this process over and over again, you will always be ahead of your competition, because by the time they're catching up, you're already on to version 2.0, 3.0. So with that, we have a few minutes for questions. Leah, do we have any questions?
Hop back on here. I did get one question.
Okay.
It says, in a larger organization, is it possible that bottlenecks could differ greatly from C-suite to front lines? And how would you handle that?
So I would say that for sure, bottlenecks, business bottlenecks, vary dramatically from C-suite to frontline. But industry bottlenecks, I would argue, don't vary from C-suite to frontline. It's a bottleneck that the entire industry has. Now, the frontline may not see that bottleneck, or the C-suite may not see that bottleneck. I mean, I can tell you, several examples of really good companies that found their industry bottlenecks from their frontline people seeing a problem that the C-suite people couldn't see. So the perspective is different from C-suite to frontline, and the insights are different, but the bottlenecks, the industry bottlenecks, are the same.
Okay, great. We have a couple minutes, guys. If there's any questions, please put them in the chat or the Q&A. I know that was a ton of information. My notes over here look a little crazy. Y'all go ahead and put those in the chat. And then let's see.
I was going to say, if anybody wants to go in more detail like that C-suite question, I can talk specifically to your industry. If you just send me an email, we could talk, a little more detail about that.
Okay, great. I will be sure and include your email in the follow-up. And I'm also checking Facebook really quickly to see if there's any comments there. All right, well, it looks like we're good. Let's give a big round of applause to Barrett. Thank you so much for joining us today. I know I get new insight every time that you speak with us. I really appreciate you being with us. And then thank you guys all for attending. You'll receive a recap later today that includes the resources mentioned and links to rewatch and share the webinar. Be sure to check out the other upcoming events that we have at Petra. Visit petracoach.com and click the events tab. And we have a whole section of new stuff coming your way. And as always, if there's any other way we can assist you, drop us a line at info@petracoach.com. We'll be happy to help you in any way we can. Barrett, thank you again so much for your time, and we will see you all next time.
My pleasure. Thank you, Leah. Thank you, Petra. Thanks, everybody.